And then that's.
I'll call the meeting to order. I'd like to begin by acknowledging we are in Treaty 1 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. My name is Neil Harden. I'm chairing the panel today. With me is Robert Buss and Lynn Nesbitt. The assessor is Marcia Mizaraki. Did I get that right?
You did, thank you very much.
And the secretary is Kara Balshaw. We will be hearing applications for revision of the assessment rule in accordance with the Municipal Assessment Act. The matters for which revision is requested have been described in each application, and we will limit discussion to those matters. The statements that the applicants or the assessor make at this hearing are sworn testimony. Anyone speaking to the matters must be sworn in. Be advised that comparisons of assessments of properties are not considered evidence of market value by the board. The board is appointed annually by council and is independent of it in the city administration. It makes its decisions on the basis of the evidence provided at this hearing and issues a written order that will be mailed to all parties as soon as possible. Please note that the board's decisions with respect to an application may be appealed to the Manitoba Municipal Board if the matter pertains to assessed value or classification, or to the Court of Queen's Bench if the matter pertains to the application of exemptions from taxation. Should you wish to appeal, information on how to do so will be included in the board's order. With respect to the hearing process, I will confirm the matters to be addressed with each applicant following the swearing in. We will then have the assessor's testimony followed by questions that the applicant may have, and then the applicant's testimony followed by questions. Each side will have an opportunity to summarize if they wish. Once all the evidence about an application has been brought forward, the applicant may leave. The process will repeat for each item on the docket today. The session will close after all the applications have been heard, and the board will deliberate in private and make its decisions. You will receive the order by registered mail as soon as possible. As information, all public hearings are live streamed, recorded, and will be part of the public record. You will be sworn in.
Please state your name.
Marcia Mizaraki.
Do you swear the evidence you'll present today is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please state your name.
Rod Slaughter?
Do you swear the evidence you'll present today is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. So we will defer 1655 Inkster for now. So we'll move to 487 Fernbank Avenue. So are they, there's 2 points of appeal, I believe?
That is correct, yes. Valuation and classification.
Classification, okay. So you may proceed on valuation.
Okay, so did you want me to read the file number, roll number?
Sure.
Everything? Okay.
Everything.
So file number is 18-591. The roll number is 0500-390-5500. The address is 487 Fernbank Avenue. We have an assessed value of $649,000. The land area is 141,382 square feet. This property is assessed on land value. This uses hydro towers. If you turn to page 5 and 6, you can see pictures of the subject property. You can see it's a long strip, very tiny strip with a bigger piece in the middle. If you turn to page 6, you get a better sense of the transformers, sorry, and the land around. This property, I have a recommendation of $460,000. I'm adjusting it based on $3.25 a square foot.
Okay, and how do you feel about that recommendation?
Sorry, I didn't realize this one had one as well. What was the
Yeah,
number?
460,000. It's based on, based on $3.25.
Okay, I think we'll have to continue, Mr. Chair. We can't accept it.
Okay.
Okay.
So you can.
Okay, so I've done this adjustment basically as you've seen the picture on page 6, how there's the one main area and then there's the really long skinny corridor. So essentially what I've looked at is making an adjustment just on the bigger area. If you look on page 3, I have some comparables. I included residential just more to show the zoning. If it was actually residential, it would be much higher rates. But it is income use, so we are looking at income comparables. I feel like comparable 6 would be closest to the subject property. And I have based my adjustment on this. I think that the comparable 6 is superior to the subject property. Hence, I made an adjustment to the $3.25 a square foot. I believe that my recommendation of $460,000 is a fair and equitable value. Thank you.
Okay, questions, Mr. Slaughter?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Raki, would you agree with the following statement from the appraisal of real estate textbook, that it is the economic use of a parcel of land that determines its value in a particular market?
I would agree.
Okay. So the market value would be based on what a potential purchaser might buy the land on, and that is based on what the potential uses are, or what return they might attain from that land. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Would you agree that physical characteristics of the site need to be considered in that use analysis, location, access, all those kind of things?
Agreed, and that's why I made the adjustment. There is actually a permanent adjustment made on this property for the long skinny part kind of taken off, and it's just kind of valuing more like on page 6, like I showed.
Yeah, I
That's kind of
understand
what
that.
it's being valued on. It's not the long, it has a nominal value of that long skinny strip. The department's recognized that and made a permanent adjustment for that.
Do you know what the nominal value is? I'm just trying to figure out the breakdown.
I don't know. I
Okay.
didn't break it down. I just kind of did this for simplicity's sake.
Yeah, fair enough. So online with the question about physical characteristics, you mentioned comparison number 6 in your brief is the best comparison. That's a service site, is it not? A serviced industrial site?
Yeah, and I just, like I said, I was looking for vacant industrial land because we do have this used as industrial property because it is not an unimproved property, it's actually improved. It is not a vacant land, so to speak, but I was looking at if it was a vacant land because it is pucked industrial, it's used as industrial currently. So that's why I put the most emphasis on comparable 6.
I see. So just to be clear though, the subject is not serviced, correct?
Not service, yes, you're correct.
So yeah, it's and this is an interesting sort of valuation, but just to understand what you had just said, the main parcel of land that you're talking about, the picture on page 6, it does have the hydro substation that's situated on the property. So is that improvement is you would agree that that of course restricts any potential development of the site?
I'm not really quite sure what your question is.
Well, I guess, does your valuation consider that there's the substation located on that land?
Yes, but again, in this particular valuation, we're assessing, looking at as vacant land, like we're just using the land value, we're not taking the actual structure in terms of a value, because frankly, I think it'd be quite hard to value the transmission lines and the power lines. I don't know what the actual value of, I guess you could try to figure it out on cost, but overall, we just figured the land itself, that would be in the value, so that's why we've assessed it as such.
Okay. Hey, I'm just, because it's, in my mind, and maybe you would agree, it's kind of a bit of a crossroads. If we consider that the substation is in place, the potential for development or the potential use of the site is minimal. You can't really do anything with it. But if we, as you say, value it as a vacant, which I think is a proper appraisal technique, so I don't disagree with that. But now we're looking at, we're pretending the improvement isn't there and we're considering a vacant parcel. So that's the basis of this valuation, if I understand correctly, as if vacant?
We're taking it as a vacant industrial land. That's how we're assessing it.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, I think that is all the questions. I do have some rebuttal, Mr. Chairman, that I can present now, or I can present it at the same time as my direct.
Will you be questioning the assessor on the rebuttal?
Will I question on my rebuttal?
Yeah.
No, I'll welcome questions, but it,
Okay.
you know, if you'd like.
Well, then let's do it as part of your.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
So you can pass them around, but I'll just have them and I'll refer to that document when I get to that.
Thank you.
A lot of
Alright,
times
thanks
you
so much.
present, rebuttal will be presented as to the valuation of the land or something like that.
Exactly, yeah.
So I wasn't sure where you were going to go with that. Okay, questions on
No, not right now, no.
Robert, anything?
So there's no value added for the improvements?
No, we just have it assessed as vacant industrial land.
How come there's no value added for the improvements?
I'm not really quite sure what to tell you. It's kind of how the hydro's always been done. This is the first time hydro's ever been appealed, so. Yeah, we're just trying to get our head around it as well as to try and understand.
And the.
Like, I think when you're looking at, like, you know, say the substations and that, it's done by cost so that they do have it, the building a value, and, but we don't have it for the transmissions and the power lines. We don't have a cost for that, and it hasn't been included, so they just taken the land value as the value.
Okay, and the, so there's two pieces of land.
Well, it's actually one, like, it's one long skinny one, and then it's got like that bigger
Oh,
one.
I see, so it's
Yeah.
all, so one.
Yeah, like if you look at page 5, that's the whole roll number. That's the whole.
Yeah, right, there's just one.
Right, and then I just kind of zoomed in on the main part of the property. That's the little blip on page,
Mhm.
right there.
So how wide would that little long sliver be, like 10, 20 feet, is it, or?
I don't know.
100 feet?
I don't know, I didn't,
It doesn't be 100 feet. Based on the size of the residential.
like, if you look at the lots behind, you could probably guess, but I didn't figure that out.
Okay.
And like I said, we have done a permit adjustment for that long skinny part.
So the rate of 325
Is
is
for more of the main and then a nominal for the long, but I didn't break it all out, I just kind of ran it through and figured out a value.
That's all, thank you, that's all my questions.
You're welcome, sorry I can give you a more specific answer.
Okay, the long narrow part, is there a transmission line that runs along there?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
kind of like you can see.
So it's just wide enough for the tower?
Yeah, so if you can look on 6, you can kind of see the shadows. maybe?
Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah. All right. Okay, no more questions, so you can proceed with your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So on the main document, the one not listed, rebuttal, if I can direct your attention to that document. And on the second page, you'll see an assessment summary and a photograph of part of the subject site. This is actually the section that we've been discussing at most, where the substation lies, and the land kind of widens out, and the city has applied $3.25 a foot. So to answer Mr. Buss's question, actually, what I'll do is quickly go through the legislative scheme when we're valuing these type of properties, because it kind of gives a good background on why the city hasn't included the substation itself. So if we start with the Manitoba Municipal Assessment Act, Section 22(1) states that properties, A, owned or in held trust for, number 5, the corporation continued under the Manitoba Hydro Act, being Manitoba Hydro or a subsidiary company of Manitoba Hydro, is exempt from taxation. So hydro is exempt completely. Then what's happened is, you'll follow the page further down, there's a second act called the Manitoba Hydro Act. And in that act, Hydro, as many crown corporations do, have agreed to pay a grant in lieu of taxation. So 43.2 of the Manitoba Hydro Act states, the corporation as an operating expense shall make annually to any municipality in which land or personal property of the corporation is situated or in which the corporation carries on business, such grant towards the cost of municipal and school services as the Lieutenant Governor and Council may approve. So basically what they're saying is, we're exempt, but we're going to pay you a grant in lieu that's equivalent to what the taxation would have been. And we see this with many crown corporations and government organizations. But here's the important part, is that Section 43.2.2 of that statement that they will agree to pay grants in lieu states, for greater certainty and without limiting any exemption for municipal taxation under the Municipal Assessment Act, the corporation and its subsidiaries are exempt from all taxes levied by a municipality on the following property. conduits, poles, pipes, wires, transmission lines, plants, and equipment, and any similar property owned by the corporation or any of the subsidiaries, occupied or used by any of them in the generation, transformation, transmission, or distribution of power. So this is basically all the lines, the poles, the substations, all the equipment. And it makes sense because way back when, decades ago, there was a document called A Fairer Way to Share, I think it was. And it was talking about how when a publicly owned utility, like Manitoba Hydro, has a lot of assets that are really the ownership of the province as a whole, one municipality shouldn't gain a windfall by this sort of equipment that is really necessary for all of our way of life. And that was the basis of this legislation. So that answers the question, why don't we see an assessment on the power station? Now, where there's a bit of a controversy is, if there was a structure surrounding that power station for aesthetic purposes or anything like that, right now that is valued. And that's something that Hydro is looking into, but that's not the case with the subject property. This is just the equipment, and therefore there's no value. So what we're left with is the land. But Part B of that statement I just read, the subsection in the Hydro Act that exempts all the equipment, Part B says any land on or under which such property is situated. The land underneath that equipment, according to the Hydro Act, should not be the subject of a grant in lieu. It should also be exempt. This is something that has not been followed, and I'm not here to suggest that we should today. We didn't appeal liability, and we didn't because this is an investigation which has been going on for about 6 months now, and there's been discussions with council at Hydro, the senior council, the provincial assessor. We're trying to find out why this part of the act isn't being followed. So had we had an answer to that, we would have had liability under contention. We don't have an answer, and therefore we're only talking about the value and the classification of the assessment. But there is something underlying here that I think the board should be aware of. In clear language, this should not have an assessment. And as I explain the value of the property, it'll start to kind of make sense why. There really is no value to these properties. So on the next page 4, we talk about the definition of market value, and of course, the market value should be based on what a willing purchaser would pay for the land, typically motivated willing purchaser. And that comes back to my points being made earlier, that that's based on what uses could be generated from the land. And I'll come back to the classification part a little later, Mr. Chairman. So if I may direct you to page 5, I'll talk a bit about the site. And the assessor has done a great job of kind of describing the site for you. It's really 2 parts. The one is a very long, thin strip that runs along the back of the single-family residential houses in this neighborhood, up at the north part of the city. And the lands are located kind of west of Main Street. So you see how it runs along the edge there of all the residences. And that stretch is only 10 meters wide. You can see the aerial photos even closer here. It's a very, you've got the red dot that shows it. 10 meters, that's all it is. It stretches along the back of the residential lots. When we talk about the value of the site being driven by potential use, I can't imagine what the potential use of this site is. There is none. Nobody would buy this land for any possible development or income generating possibility. Compounding that is the fact that on one side, as I mentioned, on the east side is single family residential. On the west side is a rail line. And something happened about 2 years ago which really affects the value of any properties that are close to or adjacent to rail lines. If I may direct you to page 33 of my brief. It's in the appendix. This is a document, Guidelines for New Development in Proximity to Railway Operations, that was done by the Federation of Canadian Municipalities back in 2013. And it was a wise group of people who said, we should be cautious about allowing development within close proximity to rail lines. And the reason I say they're wise is because a terrible event happened 2 years after they did this document, and that's the disaster at Lac-Mégantic. Once that happened, all municipalities went back to this document and said, wow, what does this say again? And they started following it. And what started happening in Winnipeg is City Council follows this document now. If you try and apply for rezoning or for a development permit for anything within the setbacks stipulated in this agreement, Council will have questions. They won't allow rezoning. It oftentimes won't allow the development unless a number of things are checked off. So the value of properties in proximity to railways has changed in the last 2 years because of the effect of this document. And basically, the setback that they suggest on a major rail line is 30 meters from the edge of the railway. Our subject is only 10 meters. Even if this is a secondary line, the setback is 15 meters. So not only from a physical standpoint can this site really not be used for anything, but from a legal standpoint, it compounds that. So I agree completely with the assessor and the city assessment department by applying a nominal value on this land, but I think we're a little different in what nominal is, because nominal to me is near zero. So that explains a bit about the majority of the property. Then we come to the area that the assessor was describing, which kind of opens up a little bit. And you can see it best on page, if I may draw your attention to page 6. At the bottom picture, it's a section that widens out on the north side of Fernbank and allows for the situation of the non-accessible hydro substation. So now we have a question. Okay, if we're valuing this section of the property, do we consider that the improvement is there? Because if we do, it has no other value. And let's stop and think a moment and think about that. That brings us right back to the intent of the Manitoba Hydro Act. Because if there's improvements like this on the property, the uses are restricted or nil, and therefore the value is restricted or nil. But there is an appraisal technique that the city has used that is valid, and that is you can look at this as if vacant. So let's pretend that wasn't there. Because if this was on the market, of course, Hydro would no longer be needing it for the substation, and they'd be marketing the site as it is. And so that's a valid way to look at the land value alone. And that's what the city has done when they look at comparisons of similar type lands and what could this land attain. Now, I would suggest that although it's in a residential neighborhood, if you look on page 6 at how the site is configured, I think you'd be hard pressed to get more than one single family lot onto that site. And even that would probably have a lot of pushback from neighborhood. So I would suggest that a residential development on that site would be very difficult. And because it's within those setbacks of the rail line, they couldn't get the allowance likely to develop anything more than single family. So again, we're looking at, even if we don't include the improvements there, we have some major restrictions we have to recognize in the physical layout of the site and its proximity to the railway. On page 10, there's a number of comparisons that we've looked at over the last number of months for different types of properties that we'll be discussing today and in similar hearings coming up. We've looked at 16 different types of properties. But I think the best ones I'd like to draw your attention to, and again, this is on page 10, it summarizes, but I'll draw your attention to the photographs of each one in a moment, are indices 1, 3, 4, 6, 7, and 8, because these are all old rail corridors. So when we're talking about, let's start off and talk about what's the value of these kind of long, thin sites. Those properties really give a good indication, and I'd like to draw your attention especially to one. I don't mean to skip through the others, and I can pause and come back, but there are, well, one really interesting comparison is on page 18. This is index 8. It's called Redonda Street. It's an old CN rail line, highlighted in blue. And it might look very familiar because it's very, very similar to the subject property, except it's wider. It's 82 feet wide instead of, I think our subject is 30 feet wide, 10 meters. So it's a superior property as far as width, but very similar as far as running along the back of residential properties. And that was purchased in September 2010 for 24 cents a square foot, about $10,000 an acre. And we've time adjusted that to 33 cents a square foot. So I'll be coming back to this in summary, but I want you to think about what is the best comparison for the value of our long, thin strip. So when we talk about nominal value, I think the city must still be about $1 a square foot. There's no way that this property, even if it wasn't beside a railway line, could command a value that high. This wider property, not beside a railway line, commanded time-adjusted price of 33 cents a square foot. We're not far off on the value of the larger parcel, though. I think the city mentioned that they use $3.25 a square foot. Their best comparison, I'll talk about in my rebuttal in a moment. I'll come to that in a moment. But it was $3.63 a foot, but that was a service parcel in Lagimodia. I think it's far superior to the subject. There would be a downward adjustment. The city's downward adjusted it to $3.25. I would suggest $3 a square foot because there are still factors that have not been considered in that adjustment, such as the proximity to the rail line. So I think we're being more than fair at $3 a square foot as the potential value of that wider piece, not considering, and that's as a vacant, so not considering the improvements. I don't mean to rush through the other comparisons, but maybe what I'll do is, well, if we have time, does the board mind if I go through each one quickly? Because they'll be pertinent to each of the briefs.
Sure.
Yeah, okay. I'll go through each of these and I'll quickly talk
Are
about my...
the other ones the similar appeals?
Yeah, it's the same. I focus on different ones of this set, so I'll probably be talking about a few of these again this
Okay.
morning.
Go ahead.
Okay. Number one is old rail corridor, so a great comparison. It was a partial spur track leading off of the main rail, and it was purchased probably by one of the industrial properties for expansion purposes. They paid $1.34 a square foot. It's only 12,000 square feet in size, 12,700 square feet, has 20-foot width. So that's an example of a small, thin corridor. The second is actually a commercial property. It's rearage behind commercial properties on Pembina Highway, but it does have access off Station Road. And I think it was sold for the subdivision for the different commercial units in the front. It sold for $2.72 a square foot. This is the one that I think is probably the best comparison for my larger parcel. So again, the city said their sale at $3.63 was best. I think it's far superior. This is at $2.72. We ended up at $3. Number three is again part of an old CN rail line. It's located in Charleswood. This is 85 feet wide, so it's wider. It sold for 22 cents a square foot. These are the sort of prices people pay for old corridors. There may be a use for them. It may be speculative for development in the area later, especially if the area is part of a local area plan. Because if they have that and the next person wants to develop something, they might need this portion as well. Maybe they'll, those are the kind of things that they might do. So I'm not saying that there's a zero value necessarily, but the value is nominal on these types of properties. A wider portion that was owned by CN Rail, that's located in Charleswood, on the next page, comparison 4, sold for 19 cents a square foot, just off Wilkes. The next isn't a railway corridor, but it's similar to other properties we'll discuss today. Maybe I'll leave this one for when we discuss a property like that. But it's in a local area plan, so this is an example of land that can be accessed and is in an area designated for residential development in the near future. People will pay for that kind of property because of the principle of anticipation. Number 6, very interesting one. An old CP rail line that runs diagonally from the south of Commercial Avenue across King Edward Street to Jefferson Avenue. This is in what's called Precinct T, and it is now actually developed as, I think it's called Meadowwood Gardens. But it's really interesting what the developer did here. They saw this old rail line. They said, we'll pay the nominal amount, which is usually 10 or 20,000 an acre. They paid a bit more in this case because they saw the potential that being in a residential area, they could actually fit residential lots along this site. The physical nature of this site allowed for something, and also the fact it's in a local area plan. It's designated for development. The potential saw the purchaser saw the potential, and they paid 50 cents a square foot. That's kind of a best case scenario for what can happen with these lines. Number 7 is an old rail corridor in White Ridge. I'm not sure what the purpose of the purchase was, but it was purchased for $1 a square foot. That has 50-foot width. Number 8 is the one we talked about on Redonda. Old rail line selling for 24 cents a square foot. And the remainder, Mr. Chairman, I'll come to later because they're more for larger lands which are in a raw state, either slated for development or not. And we'll discuss those in a later presentation. So I think that'll complete the analysis on the subject properties comparisons. And I think we provide a fairly compelling argument of why the thin portion would command no more than 40 cents a square foot. That's at the higher end, especially considering the rail lane proximity. And the larger parcel would be at just under what the city's using, $3 a square foot. However, this brings me to my second big point that you mentioned at the beginning. We have 2 points of contention. This whole valuation is based on the assumption that the property is vacant. Because again, if we consider that the equipment is there, there's very little value. And the value of this whole site would be nominal. You can't do anything with it. There's hydro equipment on the site. If we run with the hypothesis that both the city and we have, that we value as a vacant, and use comparisons that were purchased for different uses like this, we have to consider that the highest and best use is as the zoning stipulates, which is residential. It makes sense. The only people who would buy this land would be the owners of the properties behind to stretch out their yards perhaps, or as I mentioned, maybe a single family lot might physically get into that one area. But that's likely the highest and best use. It's zoned for residential development. So if I may pause for a moment and go back to the legislation. And this is a document called the Classification of Property Value Regulation. This is the document that basically tells us what classification should a property be applied when we're taxing it. And the category residential 1 is defined as the class of property known as residential 1 consists of the following. And there's A is a property that's used for residential B, but C is undeveloped, unimproved, vacant or abandoned land that is lawfully usable primarily for a residential purpose, and on which there may lawfully be constructed a building that contains not more than 4 dwelling units. So I mentioned at the beginning, we're at a bit of a crossroads. Do we say that the value is nothing because there's hydro improvements on it, which actually falls in line with the Manitoba Hydro Act? Or do we say, as the city has, nope, ignore the improvements, the value is a vacant. Okay. We now have a vacant parcel of land lawfully usable as residential. The classification must be residential. Therefore, I'm asking the board to change the value of the assessment to the value I proposed, $199,000, the main difference being the value on the long, thin strip between ourselves and the city. And in applying that value, recognize that we are applying that value when the assumption is vacant, and therefore apply the classification residential. The very last thing I'll do, Mr. Chairman, is mention 2 things. Actually, I'll skip that. I'll just go right to, very quickly go through the rebuttal, if I may. The city had 4 comparisons at the beginning, which were small, serviced, single-family lots. I don't think those are applicable in this case for the reasons I mentioned earlier. The subject isn't in a configuration that would allow that, nor is it serviced at this time. They mentioned a property on Hamel, and I have an aerial photo of that property. And that property was actually, at the time of sale, registered for a condominium plan that was to be subdivided and rezoned as multifamily. So it's really a multifamily sale that the purchaser was buying, or a multifamily property that the purchaser was buying. And I have excerpts from the city council minutes to that effect in the appendix. So I think it's not a comparable property. And the one that the city had put the most reliance on is 733 Lagimodier, and I have an aerial photograph of that property too. I know this property well because we worked for the adjacent property owner, Arnold Brothers, and they sold this property with an easement being allowed over their property to access the subject property. And it's a serviced industrial lot, great location. I think it's far superior to the subject property as an industrial lot. So these are the reasons why we don't think we should be as high as the 363. It should be less than that for that one large part of the subject property. I think I will leave the rebuttal at that. I have supporting documentation to my comments, but again, we either value the property at a nominal, minimal value with the assumption that the improvements are on the site, or we value it as a vacant as the city had, and then we have to change the classification to what the zoning would indicate, which is residential.
And what's the current classification?
It's called other.
Other?
Yeah, so that's the highest tax rate,
60. What's it zoned at?
residential. And that's all, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Okay, questions?
Yeah, okay, so I'll start with the quantum first. So on page 10, when you're talking about your comparables, you're saying 1 to 8 are your most, your best comparables for the subject property?
1, 3, 4, 6, 7, and 8 are the old rail corridors.
Okay, did you have any more current, I noticed, I guess number 5 is a more current sale, but you have nothing that's closer to the date.
Unfortunately, no, and this was about 3 months of research to find
Right,
these.
and then
But
how did, sorry.
I have time adjusted them.
Yes, and I
Yeah.
was wondering, how did you determine a time adjustment if you don't have more current sales?
Very difficult. What I try and do, if I don't have paired sales to do a proper time adjustment, I look to what the typical increases are across the market for that type of property class, and I determined that it appeared to be approximately 15% over each cycle. And so when I take that back to an amount, it works out to 0.63% per month. So I use that factor to take any sale from its date up to April 16th.
Okay, so you don't have any current sales, but you're trying to find other sales to create a time adjustment?
No, I don't have enough sales to do a proper time adjustment, so I
Okay.
look at overall value increases within that property class.
So they wouldn't necessarily be properties that are similar to the subject property?
No.
Okay, thank you. And just noticing as well, would you say that the sales that are between the city and the rail would be open arm's length transactions on the marketplace?
Sorry, which,
The sales that are between the rail, CN, CP, and between the city purchasing, and would you say that these were out on the market, these were being marketed, it was?
I can't answer how long the exposure time was, but I would argue that the city wouldn't likely pay more than what they feel is appropriate.
All right, okay. And then also just wondering, when you have multiple sale on the index 2, is it just multiple sales in terms of it was like one whole parcel and it was broken down? Or I'm just trying to determine what's the actual rate. Was it actually $272 a square foot, or how is it broken down?
Oh, I see, when I say multiple, that's
Yeah.
because I was trying to find out what the current assessment of the site was.
Right.
But that has, since the time of the sale, has been subdivided, so there is no, that roll number doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
That's
And
all I meant by
And
that.
it's zone commercial, so you'd say that's a good comparable for the subject property?
I was using that, it's not a good comparison, but based on what I have here, it was one of the only ones I could look at for the larger piece that, arguably, if it was vacant, could be used for something. And that's very similar to this site. It's a larger, wider piece that's kind of set back from others and could be used for something.
Okay, and then number 6, you have commercial King Edward, that property?
Yes.
Index number 6. You have zoning as residential. Were you aware that it was originally sold as farm and then zoned as residential later on?
We had talked about that, and I did some researching. I researched the city council minutes on that precinct T, and I actually think it was, and also we verified it with our valuations group, and they had also verified that it had residential zoning, because this person purchased it after council had passed that precinct T could be developed. So I'm not sure why the discrepancy, but from the research, since you mentioned that, I wanted to make sure I dug into that, and I'm seeing that it actually was zoned
Okay, because when I looked at the zoning, it came up as agricultural, that's why I was questioning, and
Yeah.
just noticing, like, looking at your comparables overall, it seems like there's a pattern. If it's agricultural, the rates are a little bit lower than residential zoning, and I was wondering if you're aware of that pattern as well.
Yeah, one of the things I look at with land, it gets kind of messy, but it's not necessarily what it was at the time, although that one you mentioned, Index 6, was at that time residentially zoned because that was part of the plan. But what the purchaser is buying, and what I mean by that is if the property is zoned agricultural and then that you find after the sale it was developed, the purchaser obviously had quite a comfort that that zoning was going to be revised by council. And it's usually because the area has been designated as a development area in a local area plan. So I try and get into the mindset of the purchaser when they're buying the land. And oftentimes that's exactly the case. It says that it's agricultural at the time of sale in, let's say, June 2014, but by 2015, it's being subdivided and developed into residential lots. The purchaser probably knew that they had a great certainty they were going to get that zoning. So I try and do that research on each one as well. The ones where they're not in a local, and this is interesting, because when I look at these comparisons, you start to see the patterns. The ones that are not in a local area plan, that are basically raw land for speculation way down the road, command a very low value. The ones that seem almost identical, but are in a local area plan, and their zoning may be agricultural, but sure enough, it became residential soon after, they command a higher value. Why? Because the purchaser knew that the value of this land was about to appreciate greatly. The horizon of time to development was shorter in those cases, and the value increased. So I think it's a very good question, Ms. Mizraki, and I have tried to look at each of the zoning and the conditions at the time to try and understand the motivations of the sale.
And then just another question, this property currently is owned by Hydro, that's correct?
Yes.
And the property is used by Hydro as well?
Yes.
Okay, so on page 4, when you're talking about your classification, it clearly states it's undeveloped, unimproved, vacant, abandoned. The property, just by its nature of being a hydro property, is an improved property and would have to be maintained in the classification that it is currently. Would you agree?
No, because and I mentioned it, it's a kind of a crossroads. We're trying to value the land regardless of ownership in a fee simple situation. If we consider it in use by hydro, that means we're considering the improvements in place. Therefore, the value is nominal because you can't do anything with the land except what it's being used for. And it ties in with the intent of the Hydro Act to say, if there's a hydro line on it, we shouldn't be paying tax or a grant in lieu on it, because there's no value. But what we've done here is an exercise in value as if vacant. And if we do that, and we apply a value that's based on that assumption, so now we increase the value because we're saying it could be used for something else, well then we must follow the regulation and say that we're considering it as unimproved vacant land, primarily lawfully used for residential development. So I hope that answers the question of why I think it's one or the other. Minimal value or market value with the proper classification.
So you agree that it's owned by Hydro and it's a grantable property. Would you say that it's fair to have a grantable property that's a residential classification? Would you say that it goes according to the classifications and according to the Hydro Act?
Yes, I think the Hydro Act is simply saying we'll pay grant in lieu as if it was taxed, like we'll pay the equivalent of. And the Municipal Act says you classify it based on the proper classification. So I've seen many examples of grants in lieu for various classifications, residential, agricultural, commercial.
But the very nature of the use of the property is for Hydro, is that correct?
Currently it is being used
Right,
as Hydro. Yes.
so it's not an undeveloped or unimproved or vacant or abandoned land. It is owned by Hydro, is used by Hydro, thus the classifications should stay the same. Would you agree?
No, because I'm valuing it in fee simple. And so if we are valuing it as if the improvements were there, I think the value should be less than what I'm stating.
Again, though, I think we're going back to what the Hydro Act is that we're not allowed to, and you agree to that as well.
We're not allowed to.
We're not allowed to assess for the hydro poles and all that stuff that's listed on your page. Do you have a
Yeah, but or the land, so that's where we're into a bit of a
Yeah,
crux.
but again, I'm assessing for the land that's beyond, right? It doesn't have necessarily transformers on.
Well, I think even the wider part has the substation, the rest has the line. So I guess there's a small portion at the back, but,
Thank you, that's all my questions.
okay.
All right, Robert, any questions?
Yes, do you have the breakdown of the land? That you're asking us to put 40 cents a square foot, I believe you said, on the long, narrow strip, but I don't see a breakdown anywhere of how much is in the narrow strip and how much is in the rectangular, more rectangular piece.
Yeah, on page 27, I've summarized actually, I think I mentioned it in the property description too, but I did an aerial map measurement and determined on page 27, you'll see the breakdown. 84,000 square feet is the long, thin strip.
Okay.
And then 55,000, so it's about 2/3, 1/3. 55,000 is the wider part.
And on your sales that you mentioned in page, on page 18, you showed us a long, narrow property that sold for 33 cents a square foot. Do you know if that land has been used for something, or is it still sitting there like that? I forget what number that's,
I think
index
it-
number 8.
Yeah, I think it's still sitting there because it still has an assessment for the whole thing. So if it was being used, I'd imagine it'd be subdivided and the roll number wouldn't exist.
Okay,
Can I speak to that?
Yeah.
It's a bicycle path.
that's part of that bicycle path. So
Yeah.
that was purchased by the city, is that?
Yeah.
And that makes sense because it's exempt on the classification, so.
That's all my questions, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Lynn, any-
Yeah, I do have a question just about your discussion on classification. So the long skinny piece currently has hydro poles and transmission lines, correct?
Yes.
And the larger piece has the hydro substation.
Yes.
Despite all that, it's zoned as residential, but you're asking the board to not consider the use of the property currently and to go with what the zoning is on the property, is that correct?
Correct. In the classification, the language actually is, it's a good question because when we value the property, it's not necessarily in its current use, it's the use that the market, it's the market use, I guess. And what they say in that classification part on page 4 is undeveloped, unimproved, vacant, or abandoned land that is lawfully usable. And that's why I'm suggesting if we're gonna value it based on the potential use as residential.
But by the fact that there is hydro poles and a substation there, you would still consider that undeveloped? I
Well-
appreciate that the assessor's not using that part in their valuation of the land,
Right.
but would you consider that to be undeveloped despite the presence of structures?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one I've battled with for a while, but in my mind, if I consider it its current use, that means the potential uses that the market could purchase the site for are limited to nil. Because you can't develop on a site with a substation or hydro lines. You might be able to get parking underneath, but there's no demand for that in this area. And so, I guess it's inappropriate is what I'm presenting to the board. In my mind, it's inappropriate to say that we're gonna value the property based on the sales of properties used for these other uses, but not follow the classification that would apply to properties in that use.
Are you familiar with the fixed grant provision in the City of Winnipeg Charter with respect to hydro lines and pools?
No. This grant in lieu that you're talking, or is it the?
It's not in the Hydro Act, it's actually within the City of Winnipeg Charter. I can't remember, I'd like to actually see the provision to remind myself. But there is a fixed provision which provides that hydro does pay a grant in lieu on the lines and poles within the City of Winnipeg.
Really? And this would be under the assessment portion of the charter?
No,
No.
it's not. It's within the City of Winnipeg Charter, I can't remember the provision itself.
On the actual lines and poles? because we have never seen any values applied.
No, I know that, because it's not a, that's why I don't think it's assessment, I think it's an actual fixed rent.
So maybe that's something that's not through property assessment though. Okay, and that would make sense, because they could probably charge something that would be almost like a personal property sort of thing, but it wouldn't be contemplated.
It's not even, I can't even remember, I'm just,
Is you on all up?
yeah. It's within the charter though, right? Not the assessment.
Yeah, there's all.
And I only have the portion dealing with assessment.
I am not sure, I don't, it's not that. Is this the whole of the charter?
I don't have the whole of the charter either, but I have the main assessment portion.
It's not in the assessment portion.
Yeah.
I think it's in the finance.
Oh.
Anyway, that's all my questions. I was just asking really about the classification side.
Okay.
Thank
And
you.
this is
Thank
new
you.
to me, the hydro, so.
Those sort of long, narrow strips, would it be fair to say their value would depend upon whether the adjacent land owners have some?
That's a great point. Not in this case, but there are some where, through the research, I found that there was a demand, for example, parking on the site because the adjacent property, there's one that's beside a care home, I think it was. And so there's actually a number of examples where lands like this might have demand for some surface parking.
I think I can remember one where it was industrial use and the owner of the adjacent parcel wanted more land for parking trailers or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
And bought the abandoned CN line adjacent to his property.
And that very first comparison I mentioned is probably exactly like that. It was an old spur line behind, I think, Macmore Industries, and they probably purchased it for. So it's a great question, and it's something that I look at in every case. I look at what is the likelihood that the surrounding properties may use this land or need this land for something. But in this case, I don't think that's possible for two reasons. It's all single-family residential that runs along that site, and secondly, its proximity to the rail lines. So this is kind of an anomaly, actually, for that reason. You may see, if not this morning, when I'm back on other cases like this, that issue comes up, and I try and recognize that in the valuation.
Okay.
Can I just speak? I'd
Yeah,
like to
go ahead.
apologize to the board and to everybody here. It relates to telephone services.
Oh, okay.
And it's a fixed assessment.
Yeah, and there's fixed assessment on railway as well.
Yeah.
No, this is an actual
Yeah.
within the charter.
Yeah.
On section 323, if anybody cares.
Okay.
But I apologize.
No problem.
Something in my brain had said before it
Yeah.
was previously
There's so
also
many,
hydro.
and like there's a railway one that's similar and it has a separate act. Like there's many of them that have separate acts.
Different things.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, I have no more questions, so do you wish to have a summary?
Yeah, I just wanted to sum up. Just wanted to state that my value of $460,000 I think is a fair and equitable value. And I wanted to state that this property is used by hydro, is assessed as such, and the classification should remain the same. And just to clarify, it even states like an improvement is a building, a fixture, a structure that is erected or placed in or over under the land, whether or not the building, fixture, or structure is affixed to the land is capable of being transferred without special mention of the transfer of the land. That's a definition of an improvement. We're just going by what the classifications state, that this is an improved property, is used by hydro, therefore the classification should not be changing. Thank you.
Flower?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I stated it a few times, but we have to, if we're looking at the use of the property, we have to look at the physical and legal considerations which would dictate the highest and best use. And the realities of this site are that the uses are extremely limited, even notwithstanding the hydro lines being in place. And therefore the value should be reduced. But I also argue that that value that we've reduced it to is still based on sales of properties that were residential or agricultural in some cases in use. Their zoning, or sorry, their classifications reflect that. If we're using that value based on those type of properties, we should follow the classification on the property as well. And the zoning is residential. So I ask for the lower value and the classification to be changed.
Okay, thank you for that. think we'd be good for about a 5-minute break now, till 10 o'clock, and then we can come back and, I think we covered a lot on the other properties as well. We'll come back into session. The next one is 510 Gulfsby Street.
To make this quick, Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to ask for a confirmation on this assessment.
Okay, do you have any objection to that?
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, could you read
Oh, sure, sorry.
the tombstone information?
Okay, so file number 18-593, roll number 0206278090, 510 Wolski Street, with assessed value of $869,000. Thank you.
Okay. Short and sweet. Next one is 1135 Story Road.
So we have file number 18-612, roll number 0500936210. That's 1135 Story Road. We have an assessed value of $1,544,500. On this property, I am making a recommendation of $1,281,000. This is based on 67 cents per square foot.
67 cents per square foot.
That's correct.
Okay, and how do you feel about that valuation?
It's actually very close, Mr. Chairman, to ours. So I will accept the value, but I have the same concerns about classification on this due to the zoning.
Classification, do you want, I guess you leave on classification. Is there anything you wish to add then on classification?
No, do you want me to quickly go through the property to show why I think the classification is?
Well, we haven't had the description of the property as yet.
Yeah, I guess I'll keep it short. It's the same logic. This one is zoned agricultural right down the road, and it's in an agricultural area. All the surrounding properties are agricultural. It's not even against this edge of the city. It kind of stretches up from Templeton all the way up to the, so it's kind of in a very isolated area. So again, following the logic that if the value that we're agreeing to is based on sales of properties with a certain use, I don't think it's appropriate to ignore the classification that should follow in that case, because we're doing a hypothetical, right? It's, as the assessor had said, well, how can you not consider the improvements? And I agree, but that's the hypothetical exercise we're doing in this fee simple analysis. It's as if vacant, and that's how we derive the value, and therefore, we need to look at the classification. So it's the same argument, but in this case, it's agricultural, not residential.
Okay, anything that you wish to add from the previous?
It's it's kind of the same idea as the other one. I'm not gonna go into great detail. It's got the transformers on it. It's not actually vacant. There's considered improvements on it. Therefore, we have to stay the classification the same as other.
Okay, Robert, any questions to either party on classification?
Yeah, generally the classification based on use, not what the surrounding properties, or not what would happen to it if the improvements were removed or something, but based on its actual use. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think there's decisions that kind of debate, is it based on use or the zoning, and I think use seems to be more the preferred approach. But again, I guess I come back to the point that if we are then considering the hydro lines in place, how do we use the same value of lands that don't have hydro lines in place and don't have those restrictions? How do we base the value on that? Should there not then be some deduction on the value to reflect the restricted use of our subject compared to the comparables? I haven't done that exercise. That's why I'm asking for the classification.
I'm concerned that we're getting two things mixed up here. We have to deal with the value on one side and classification on the other side, and they're kind of separate issues.
Yes, but again, my value, and I think the cities, we're probably following the same logic, is based on properties that don't have the restrictions of hydro lines. So do we then make an adjustment in the value to reflect the restrictions on the property?
Well, that's what we would have to decide, and then once we've decided on the value, then we would do the classification. Would you agree with that? They should be kept separate?
They should be kept separate, yeah, so let me back it up and look at it that way, that if we are then going to say, we're valuing the property with hydro lines in place, I think we're too high on the value then, because none of our comparisons have that restriction. I was going under the assumption of the value as if vacant, and then I was running with the classification.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
And then any questions to either party on the class?
This is just the same type, it's the transmission
Yes.
line, another larger
Right.
piece that has, and
Yes.
is it assessed in the same way, a really nominal assessment?
Right, it's just the difference in this property, you'll notice that it's zoned agricultural.
Zoned agricultural,
So
so it still
then,
has.
that's
the-
why the rate would be a lot lower than the other one that's zoned, the residential, or we have it as vacant industrial, right? Like that's what the assessed value would be, even though it's zoned residential, the use was industrial in the other property. The difference with this property, it's zoned agricultural. So when you start looking at comparables for agricultural property, the land value would be definitely lower. So that's why I'm representing the 62 cents as opposed to the 325 on the other one.
And the 67 cents is for it's like the overall.
Right, correct.
It's not the nominal and the.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, because this one's a little bit, if you look at the actual shape of the property, I have pictures on page 6.
Yeah, that's what I was on 5.
Yeah, you can see it's a little bit, this is not quite the same little sliver as the other.
It's a little bit wider.
Yes, that's correct.
And is the other piece the same size, Jim?
I don't know, I didn't take measurements of each one, but it's definitely a wider quarter than the other one.
And what was your recommendation?
Sorry, it was 67 cents and the overall value was 1,281,000.
Okay. All right, I guess any need for summation on?
I just want to quickly point out, like, it actually states classes of property. It states right in the book, it says the classes of property which are based on the type, use, size, and ownership of land or buildings, or any more of them are set out in section 2. So it actually states right in there, it's the owner, like who's using, who owns the land, who's using it, that's how it's classified. Thank you.
Okay, I think I'm probably losing ground on the classification issue. And I think in rethinking this, I probably should have just recognized the restrictions on the subject property in comparison to the sales comparisons in a value sense. I'll leave that for another day, I suppose, just to explain the rationale. All of the sales that justified, and this is an example where I broke down the property into the different sections, like you were saying, you know, what's happening at each section of the property.
What page are you
On page 28, it's the summary of everything, which comes very close to the assessor's recommendation, which is why I'm accepting it. But now, I'm hesitant to be taking a value that's higher than even the surrounding properties, when our property has the restrictions that those properties don't. So I will maintain my position, Mr. Chairman, that if I'm taking this higher value, I do ask that the appropriate classification be applied, and I'll stay with that.
Okay, fair enough. All right, now we will go to the no address one, rule number RA 0600575500. So you can proceed
Thank you.
on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. File number 18-509, roll number 0600575500. This property is land area of 2,288,019 square feet. I have a recommendation on this property as well. After looking at this property, I considered basing it on 62 cents per square foot. So an overall value of $1,419,000.
What value, what Rate?
Sorry, 62 cents per square foot.
62 cents.
Yes, and it comes out to 1,419,000, it's rounded.
Okay, and how do you feel about the valuation?
We'll continue, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So if you turn to page 5, you can see a picture of the subject property. This property we have as a farm property because there is no improvements on this property. There was a garage, so we had it originally packed as industrial, used as industrial. But in talking to Mr. Slaughter, we have confirmation that the garage no longer exists, so we probably will be repacking this property as a vacant agricultural piece of land because there is no improvements on this property. So based on that, if you look at my comparables on page 3, they're a little bit higher, I believe, than what the subject property should be going for. And I used the comparables that I had on the other property for the vacant agricultural land, and that's where I came up with the 62 cents per square foot, which I think is a fair and equitable value. Thank you.
Okay, just a quick question, whereabouts is this property?
Oh, sorry, this is the south perimeter. There's Plessy's Drive. If you look at my picture,
Okay.
it's just right
Oh,
there.
I
is
see,
Plessy's.
yeah.
Yeah, and there's access point here, and my picture's kind of cut off, but Mr. Slaughter has a better one. There's another road point there as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, any questions of the assessor?
Just one, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Raki, would you agree that a property located in an area designated by council or bylaw as residential development would command a higher value than a property that was not located in such a designated area?
Yes?
Okay, that's all the questions, thank you.
Okay, Lynn, any questions of the assessor?
No, thank you.
Okay, Robert, any questions of the assessor?
No, not at this time, thank you.
Okay, and I have no questions, so you can give us your presentation on that.
Thank you. I have some rebuttal as well, and I'll maybe start with the direct presentation, Mr. Chairman, and then
Okay.
I'm going to talk about all the land.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
So starting with the direct evidence, not the rebuttal. On page 2 is a photograph of part of the land. And in this case, we have no concerns about classification. It is zoned and classified agricultural. On page 5 is the overhead of where it's located. So it's south of the perimeter and east of Lagimodier. And it's kind of an irregular shaped lot with a small access off of a small dirt road called Mailhot, and then also off the dirt road, Plessis Road at that point from the east side. And the majority of the property is kind of this larger center in the middle. So you see the aerial photos of different sections on page 5 and 6. And you can see that the surrounding properties are either large single-family lots or farm lots. And on page 7, this is a photograph of the land area plan map from the city of Winnipeg. And in this location, the subject is kind of in between two areas that have been designated for future development, but it is not yet designated as an area for development. It's situated where the red dot is on that map, the white being not designated areas. So we have the same subset of comparisons, but in this case, because it's not a rail corridor, this is a large agricultural land. And so we've looked at the best comparisons being numbers, well, the ones that are zoned agricultural actually, so 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 13, and 15. If I could draw your attention to the properties that I think are best are 10, 11, and 13. So if I could ask you to turn to page 20. This This is an example of a slightly smaller, but still very large, rectangular lot. It's superior to the subject in that it has full frontage on St. Boniface Road. It's raw land just like the subject. So here's an example of a property that's not in a designated planned area. So this area of the city is not yet designated for any development. So anybody buying this land, their speculation is quite far off. And I mentioned earlier that when we look at the kind of the horizon in the likelihood of development, the prices diminish the further away you are. It makes sense. So it's kind of like a speculative purchase, but it's a long way off. And so lands in this condition, raw agricultural lands in an area that isn't in the foreseeable future being developed, command in the value like this, and that's at about $10,000 an acre. A similar one is in the same area. It's off St. Boniface Road and it has access off Symington, and it's closer in size to the subject property. That commanded 9 cents a foot. When we look at a property that's in a designated area, like comparison 12, this is in a residential area and it's going to be part of Canterbury Park. In this case, the purchaser will purchase the land with the knowledge that they can turn around their profit in a relatively short amount of time, and they are going to pay a higher amount. So this is an example where you see prices in the over $1 a square foot. But then we go back to another property that's not in a designated area, and we see again a value of 9 cents a square foot. And we could go through this exercise with the rest of the comparisons, but we'll see that differentiation. It's really, is it in an area that's going to be developed, and it makes sense for the person to pay decent money for that lot, or is it way down the road, is not yet designated as development? So what we're asking, actually I'll pause there for a moment, Mr. Chairman, if I may go to the rebuttal evidence. Because now my position is that, and I think Ms. Mizraki is exactly right, the comparisons are superior, but what further differentiates these comparisons that the city has is that they are in designated areas for development. So the first one is in Charleswood, the very first comparison. It's a 9.2 acre site, and you can see where it's located here, just behind these houses. And it's classified as A right now, agricultural, but it's part of Precinct Q, which is the Ridgewood South Precinct Plan. And I have an excerpt from that plan on page 8 and 9. You can see that this is a designated area. The subject property is located kind of at the west end, and the development is already started. They're starting to develop this area from the west, actually, and they're moving inwards. And so this subject property will be part of a development plan in the very near future. Once an area is designated as an area plan, the zoning can change very quickly. The purchaser has a certainty that they're going to be able to attain a generous return for their investment. And the subject is located in this pink area, which is the next slated area for development in Precinct Q. That's on the next page there. So I think that explains why it would be quite a bit higher than the subject property. The next is a similar situation. It's in West Kildonan. At first, I didn't know, because the roll number doesn't exist anymore. So Murray Avenue is a long road that stretches between McPhillips and Main Street. And we weren't sure where it was, but since then our evaluation group has determined it was on the west end of that site. So I thought it was in what's called Precinct G, but it's actually in Precinct F, and it was designated in 2011 for development. It's called the North Point Village. It's in this area here. So again, it makes sense. Whoever bought this land, it appears to be an agricultural land, which one would suspect at first glance is comparable to the subject. But because it's a location, this is really more of a residential land very soon, and that's why the person is paying more money. That makes sense. The third comparison is on Sturgeon Road, and from what I can tell, this isn't in a designated area. What's interesting is that despite the sale price in 2014, the city is using 40 cents a square foot as their assessment. I have a copy of the 2019 assessment on page 13. So the assessed value is 40 cents a square foot for this site. But where this site is superior to the subject property is it has two sides of frontage off Sturgeon and another one off the Sturgeon access road here. And it just has a greater access for development potential or use. And it's also 1/10 the size. So based on economies of scale, we have to make an adjustment. And again, it's assessed at 40 cents a foot. And the last is in the designated area called Wilkes South Secondary Plan. This is south of Precinct Q in Charleswood. You'll see it at the bottom of the map there. And it has very good frontage off Community Road. It's a rectangular lot. And it's sold for 71 cents a square foot. It's less than 1/10 the size of the subject. Based on all these reasons, we have to make downward adjustments to the sale as well. So I think when we look at the comparisons that we have and explain where they are in their development horizon, and then we look at the cities, I think it's pretty compelling that we would be closer to the, we were saying 10 cents a square foot up to around 25 cents a square foot. And we have applied, Mr. Chairman, value based on that analysis of all comparisons, including the cities, a value of 26 cents a square foot, which is more than twice that of our best comparisons for the full 39.7 acres of land. Now, what is very interesting, and I'm not relying upon this, but I think it's interesting, is that if you turn to page 31, this parcel of land is just not adjacent to, but just north of the subject. It's the closest similar property in the subject's location. It's a little smaller. It's a perfect rectangular site with frontage right along Plessis Road, and it's agricultural. That's a very interesting comparison, but superior with access and size. And if you go back to page 30, its assessment is 26 cents a square foot.
Well, I will caution that we don't compare assessments.
I understand. I just thought, as I say, I'm not relying upon that at all. I'm relying upon the evidence of my best comparisons at 10 cents a foot, but I thought that was a very interesting point that I wanted to bring forward. And that completes our presentation. Thank you.
Okay, questions?
Just a couple. When you're talking about your best comparables for the in comparison to the subject property, again, I'm not going to bring up the same points I already discussed about the time adjustments and uses as well. I discussed all that in quite detail before, so I'm not going to go through all that again. But you have indexes 10, 11, and 13 you said we should have the most value on. But are they not all the same one, like kind of together, the same property? Like they're different roll numbers, but it's like this piece, and that piece? So you're basically relying on one part of land that's been cut up in 3 different roll numbers?
That could be. I don't know who the vendor purchaser were in these cases, but they are in the same
Yeah,
location.
so you're not aware that they're all the same?
No, I have no knowledge.
It was all the same sale. So you would say those are, to use 3 sales that are basically between the same parties, and saying that that's what you should put all your value on?
Well, I do know there's separate transaction or instrument numbers, so I think there were separate transactions.
Separate, but it's the same vendor and seller, and it's all one piece that was broken into 3?
Yeah, I don't know anything about the vendor purchaser.
So do you think that would affect the value of the sale if they're, like, in terms of economies of scale?
If it was one large, well, I think it was still 3 separate transactions, so no, I would suggest that these are still arm's length transactions for each of the parcels.
Okay, and just in terms of, I think the chairman already mentioned, we don't compare assessments.
Yeah.
Thank you, that's all my questions.
Hey, Robert, any questions?
Those 3 sales that you just mentioned, maybe I could ask you, did they take place at the same day, at the same time, or were they separate times?
It's in his evidence, but I kind of just, when I did a bit of research, it was all between the same parties.
It was the same date.
Same day.
Yeah.
And on page 7, I missed some of the beginning there, that number 5, what are 4 and 5 on page 7? What is the significance of?
Those are areas designated as local area plans for development. So number 5 is Sage Creek.
Okay,
And I can't recall the name of number 4.
that's south of the perimeter highway.
Yeah.
Okay. And you're saying the subject property is not in an area that will be designated for, or is presently designated for residential?
That's correct. That's exactly the purpose of that map.
So Hydro owns this property, but they're not using it in any way for Hydro?
No,
For themselves, right?
nothing on this site is related to the transference of electricity.
That's all my questions, thanks.
Lynn?
So is it your belief that this piece of property is being influenced by these other designations for residential?
Not now. I guess, you know, down the road, 10 years or more, there's a likelihood that gradually the rest of the city starts to fill in and areas will be designated for development. But until such time, what I've been finding anyway is areas that aren't in an area designated for development do not command the same values of areas that are.
Thank you.
So, in terms of the current use, then does Hydro lease the land out to, for agricultural use?
No, I asked Hydro what the purpose of the site was down the road. They didn't have an answer, but I asked if there was any leases in place, and they said not at this time. So it's just vacant land.
Vacant agricultural.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you for that. Any submission that you wish to make?
No, I think I've covered everything.
Okay. Just a comment about that sale. It is possible that the same vendor and purchaser purchased the whole thing, but I think then we're just looking at a larger parcel that still commanded 10 cents a foot, and it's still superior to the subject as far as access, so I still think it's a very valid comparison.
Okay, thank you. So that concludes, I guess, your piece of the hearing. So we will now, so thank you for that.
That's it.
Thank you very much.
We're not done hearing yet. We still have to deal with the first property, which
I
is
apologize.
1655 Inkster. Let me just find that property first of all. Yes, thank you. Okay, now the appellant is not here, but we will proceed with the hearing regardless. So can you read in the information and give us a brief summation of your
Okay.
evidence?
See
Thank
you.
you. So file number 18-194, number 1406411500. This is 1655 Inkster Boulevard. The assessed value is $1,704,000. Do you want me to go through?
Just briefly what it's
Okay.
based on.
Okay, this is based on 1979 building plan area of usable area of 22,562 square feet. We have the income workup on page 4. So it shows the two premises giving us a potential rent of $127,674. We have a cap rate of 6.5. Put on an NOI of $110,738 to give us the overall value of $1,704,000. We have comps on page 3 to support our values, as well as an income and expense mailer I've included to show the rents in place. Thank you.
Okay, any questions?
No questions, Mr. Chairman.
Lynn, any questions?
No, no questions.
Okay, thank you very much. That concludes the hearing then.
Thank you.